Before Resident Evil 4 became one of the greatest games ever made, it almost looked completely different. So early in development, Capcom revealed a much darker version of the game. This version featured a mysterious ghost-like enemy known as the Hookman. The game focused more on psychological horror and hallucinations, but this version was eventually cancelled. So today we're looking at the lost Hookman version of Resident Evil 4 and why it disappeared. Before we go into the actual Hookman version of Resident Evil 4, we gotta go into the past and the development of Resident Evil 4. So by the late 1990s, the Resident Evil formula was starting to feel outdated. Earlier games like Resident Evil 1 and Resident Evil 2 used fixed camera angles and slower gameplay, so Capcom wanted the next game to reinvent the series. And if you haven't already checked out my other video on how Resident Evil always reinvents the series, it's amazing. So development started around 1999 for Resident Evil 4, and several completely different versions of the game was created, but the most famous lost version of the game was the Hookman build. So the Hookman version was first shown publicly in 2003, specifically during E3 2003 or Electronic Entertainment Expo 2003. The footage surprised fans because it looked very different from previous Resident Evil games. Instead of, fighting hordes of enemies, the demo focused mostly on atmosphere and tension, and the setting appeared to be a dark gothic castle, which we later got in the full game. You know, that gothic castle area. So you still played as Leon Kennedy, and the tone was much closer to psychological horror, and it was very, very akin to maybe the feeling that Silent Hill 2 would give you. The game sort of gave like a paranormal vibe, sort of like Fatal Frame, and that was unique to Resident Evil at the time. And I figured that, with the whole vibe of the dark castle and everything, it fits that was gonna be like a haunted castle, and Leon were to fight like ghosts or something, and that's why the Hookman also had like ghost-like features. And that's the big premises and why it's called the Hookman build, is because the enemy was the most memorable part of the demo, and he coined the name the Hookman because one arm was replaced with a large hook. So he kind of looked like a ghost or phantom like you could see in the footage, and instead of normal enemies, this creature appeared suddenly and chased Leon. So I'm assuming he was more like the stalker type enemy that we get in these modern Resident Evil games. And this Hookman seemed to, teleport and phase through bullets or walls, and this made encounters feel unpredictable and scary. Here you could also see Leon fighting these like creepy doll enemies, which I'm assuming are like paranormal dolls, which is pretty creepy too. So another unique mechanic was the hallucination system. So examples were shown in the demo where Leon would suddenly begin hallucinating, and the environment would like sort of distort, and enemies could appear out of nowhere, and there would be like a fog that would fill rooms. Reality itself seemed unstable, and this gave like a similar psychological horror feel to like Silent Hill, sort of like when you're going into the other world or when you're traveling through the fog. Instead of traditional survival horror, this version focused more on mental and supernatural horror, and it's a very big contrast from what we got in the now, current Resident Evil 4. Another interesting detail about the Hookman build is the camera system. So some scenes still use fixed camera angles, and this style came from earlier Resident Evil games where, Resident Evil 1, 2, 3, the classic ones, and even 0. And some of the spin-offs where they would have, a fixed camera angle from a cinematic point in the room, and it helped create, tension because players couldn't always see what was around them, and it would swap from the fixed camera angle to like the usual over-the-shoulder third-person perspective. And this was a major change for the series because it showed that they were a little bit iffy on this build, whether they wanted to deviate fully from the fixed camera angle and go to third person. But I'm glad that in the final build of Resident Evil 4 they went to that third person view, because it basically innovated survival horror and third person shooters for years and years to come, and it revitalized the franchise for the better. So despite how interesting the Hookman version looked, it was eventually cancelled. And why? So apparently some of the reasons included were hallucination mechanics were difficult to implement, and I could see that because, other than like scripted moments, I'm pretty sure they could find a way, but the hallucination mechanic would just go in, and gameplay felt sort of inconsistent. They also wanted to revitalize the franchise and deviate from the more survival horror and go into more actiony, which Resident Evil succeeded at. But the developers struggled to balance horror and action, especially when you're going up against the paranormal. That's more horror. Like if you're going fighting ghosts and stuff, like you would be scared. So Leon isn't a scared guy, so they wanted more of an action game. The team felt that the game wasn't fun enough with ghosts, so they created the Granados. And because of this, Capcom decided to restart development again and make a new version of the game, which eventually, that's what we got into the current day Resident Evil 4. So basically, just after they restarted development, the game changed drastically. In the final version of Resident Evil 4, obviously you guys know, it focused more on action gameplay, combat encounters, shooting mechanics, and it stuck with the revolutionary over-the-shoulder camera. And I feel like Resident Evil 4 succeeded because of that. It wasn't like the plain old Resident Evil 1, 2, 3 that we got plus the spin-offs. They revolutionized the franchise and revitalized. They gave it a breath of fresh air, you could say. And that's what helped put the spotlight back on Resident Evil. With the action, survival, horror of Resident Evil 4, it wasn't just another zombie game. It was different. They had more unique enemies too. And instead of the supernatural enemies that we would have gotten in the Hookman version, the game introduced sort of like infected villagers and cultists. This new direction ended up changing the entire gaming industry. Even if you look it up, Resident Evil 4 is one of the most influential games of all time. Basically shown us that the third person point of view and something that isn't tank controls could work. And it did, and it paid off heavily. So with that, Resident Evil 4 is now considered one of the greatest games ever. But the Hookman version shows just how different the game almost was. It could have been a much darker, more psychological horror experience, and even today fans still wonder that what would the version might have been like if it actually came out. Do you think the Hookman version would have been better, or did Capcom make the right decision changing the game? In my opinion, I think the original Resident Evil 4 and the remakes are near perfect games. I love the pivot towards action, and it really helped, give a break from all the survival horror. However, I love paranormal and I love, ghosts and everything, and it's because, in my opinion, I think that ghosts are more scary than zombies or anything. It's the most scary horror that you could get because it's psychological. It's in your mind. Although, you could make like a real ghost, it's like an entity. Sometimes you can't even kill it, you can't even see it. They're just moving things by their own, throwing things, and they like go through walls and stuff. Like Silent Hill 4 is one of my favorite Silent Hill games, and I believe that game is underrated because it focuses on the paranormal. And I think that Resident Evil could have a paranormal game and be successful. Obviously, there wasn't really any paranormal game per se right now because Resident Evil 4 switched to the action horror with the Granados, but I would love to see a paranormal Resident Evil game, even if it's a spin-off in the future. But overall, I think the original Resident Evil 4 is good because it helped make Resident Evil what it is, with the action. It pivoted it and revived it for the better. So changing that would be criminal. So that's going to be it for today's video, guys. If you like this video, please like, subscribe, and share it, and comment what you think of the Hookman version. Do you think it should have been in the main game? Do you think they should make a paranormal game in the future? Let me know your thoughts down below. Yep, Mr. Frosty Flames out.